your ID right now!
I'm recording you speeding, deputy. This is for my safety.
Stop recording or you're going to jail! You hear me? Put that phone down!
No, sir. The camera stays on.
That's it! Step out of the car! Now! You're under arrest!
The morning sun hung low over Jefferson County, Colorado, casting long shadows across State Route 42 as Marcus Thornton guided his silver Honda Accord through the early commute. It was March 12, 2024, a Wednesday that began like any other, with the promise of routine errands and the quiet satisfaction of a day off from his usual responsibilities. Marcus had spent nearly 8 years as a reserve officer with the Aurora Police Department, volunteering his weekends and evenings to serve his community during special events, parades, and traffic control operations. Though his role was part-time, his training had been anything the same as that of a full-time officer. He had graduated from the police academy, learned constitutional law, studied proper procedure, and absorbed the principles that were supposed to guide every interaction between law enforcement and the citizens they served. At 53 years old, Marcus carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who understood both sides of the badge. He knew what it meant to wear a uniform, to carry the weight of public trust, and to navigate the delicate balance between authority and accountability. He also knew, perhaps better than most civilians, exactly what his rights were when he found himself on the other side of an encounter with law enforcement. This knowledge, earned through years of training and experience, would prove to be both his shield and his weapon in the confrontation that was about to unfold. The highway stretched before him, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the suburban landscape of Jefferson County. Traffic was light for a weekday morning, with most commuters already settled into their offices or still lingering over breakfast. Marcus was in no particular hurry. His destination was the Chevrolet dealership on Colfax Avenue, where his pickup truck had been waiting for 3 days while mechanics replaced a faulty alternator. The drive was straightforward, the route familiar, and his mind wandered to the small tasks that awaited him after retrieving his vehicle. That peaceful reverie shattered in an instant. A flash of motion in his rearview mirror caught his attention, and before Marcus could fully process what he was seeing, a Jefferson County Sheriff's cruiser rocketed past him on the left. The patrol car was moving at a speed that made Marcus's own 65 miles per hour feel like standing still. There were no emergency lights painting the morning air red and blue. There was no siren wailing its urgent warning to other motorists. Just a marked police vehicle tearing down the highway as if the rules of the road were suggestions meant for lesser citizens. Marcus felt a familiar tension grip his chest. As a trained officer, he recognized immediately what he was witnessing. Emergency responses required lights and sirens, not just for the officer's safety, but for the protection of every other driver on the road. Without those visual and auditory warnings, civilian vehicles had no way of knowing they needed to yield. No way of anticipating the approach of a speeding cruiser weaving through traffic. What this deputy was doing was not just reckless, it was dangerous. It was exactly the kind of behavior that got innocent people killed. His training kicked in almost automatically. Marcus pressed his foot against the accelerator, carefully increasing his speed while keeping his eyes fixed on the rapidly shrinking shape of the patrol car ahead. His speedometer climbed past 70, then 75, and still the cruiser pulled away from him. Only when Marcus reached 80 miles per hour did the gap between them stabilize, and he watched the deputy continue at that pace, casual and unconcerned, as if exceeding the speed limit by 15 miles per hour was simply how one drove a patrol vehicle on a routine Wednesday morning. With his left hand steady on the wheel, Marcus reached for his phone with his right. He activated the camera and held it up toward the windshield, capturing several seconds of footage that showed his own speedometer at 80 and the patrol car ahead, maintaining pace without any emergency indicators active. The evidence was clear. This was not an officer responding to a crisis. This was a deputy who had decided that the laws he was sworn to enforce simply did not apply to him. Marcus considered his options. He could let it go, file the footage away, and continue with his day. That would certainly be the easier path. But something in his training, something in his sense of professional duty, refused to accept that compromise. He had seen too many instances of minor abuses growing into major problems, too many cases where silence enabled the kind of behavior that eroded public trust in law enforcement. If officers like this were never held accountable, they would continue to believe they were above the law, and eventually that belief would lead to something far worse then a speeding violation. If you find yourself drawn into stories like this, tales of ordinary people standing up against those who abuse their authority, then I want to invite you to stay with me through to the end. This story takes turns that you might not expect, and the lessons it offers about constitutional rights and the reality of police encounters are more relevant today than ever before. Consider subscribing if you want to understand how power really works in America and how individuals can push back when that power is misused. The patrol car disappeared from view as the highway curved ahead, and for a moment, Marcus thought he had lost his opportunity. But then, as he rounded a bend near the intersection with 112th Avenue, he spotted the cruiser again. The deputy had pulled someone over, his vehicle positioned at an angle behind a dark blue sedan on the shoulder of the road. The emergency lights were now active, painting the morning air with their alternating flashes of red and blue, a stark contrast to their conspicuous absence just moments before. Marcus made a decision in that instant, one that would alter the trajectory of his entire day and ultimately cost the taxpayers of Jefferson County a substantial sum. He signaled his intention to exit the highway, guided his Honda onto the shoulder, and came to a stop approximately 70 yards ahead of the traffic stop. He was well clear of the encounter, positioned far enough away that his presence could not possibly interfere with whatever business the deputy was conducting. His only intention was to capture footage of the officer's face and badge number, documentation that would support the formal complaint he planned to file with the sheriff's office. He lowered his window and extended his phone toward the scene behind him, recording the distant figures of the deputy and the stopped motorist. The morning air carried the faint sounds of traffic, the occasional whoosh of vehicles passing on the highway, and the mechanical hum of engines idling. Marcus sat patiently in his vehicle, making no move to exit, taking no action that could be construed as interference. He was simply a citizen exercising his constitutional right to document the behavior of a public servant. What Marcus did not know, could not have known in that moment, was that his very act of documentation had already been noticed. The deputy had observed the silver Honda pulling over ahead of his traffic stop. He had seen the phone extended from the window, and something in that observation, something in the knowledge that his actions were being recorded by a stranger, had begun to stir a reaction that would soon spiral into a full-blown constitutional crisis. The traffic stop concluded without incident. The deputy handed the motorist whatever citation or warning he had written, exchanged a few final words, and stepped back as the blue sedan merged onto the highway and disappeared into the flow of traffic. Then, instead of returning to his patrol duties, instead of climbing back into his cruiser and continuing his shift, Deputy Raymond Kowalski turned his attention toward the silver Honda idling on the shoulder ahead. He began walking. Marcus watched the approaching figure through his side mirror, his body instinctively tensing as the deputy drew closer. There was something in the man's posture, a rigid purposefulness that suggested this was not going to be a friendly conversation. Marcus took a slow breath, centering himself, reminding himself of the principles he had learned in training. He had done nothing wrong. He had every right to be here, every right to record what he had witnessed. The Constitution of the United States guaranteed him those freedoms, and no badge in the world could strip them away. Deputy Kowalski reached the Honda and positioned himself beside the driver's window, his body language projecting an authority that bordered on aggression. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical presence that could intimidate most civilians into automatic compliance. His face was set in a neutral expression, but his eyes carried something harder, something that suggested he was not accustomed to having his actions questioned. For a moment, neither man spoke. The highway traffic continued its endless parade behind them, oblivious to the confrontation unfolding on the shoulder. Then Deputy Kowalski broke the silence with a question that carried more edge than curiosity. "Everything all right here, sir?" Marcus met the deputy's gaze with calm composure. "Everything's fine, deputy. I was hoping I could get your name and badge number." The request hung in the air between them, simple and direct, the kind of question that should have prompted an equally simple response. Every officer's name and badge number are matters of public record. Citizens have an absolute right to request that information, and officers are trained to provide it without hesitation. But something in Deputy Kowalski's expression shifted at the question, a subtle hardening around the eyes that suggested Marcus had just crossed an invisible line. My name and badge number, the deputy repeated, his tone flat. And why exactly do you need that information? So I know who I'm filing a complaint against. A complaint? About what? Marcus felt the familiar weight of the moment settling over him, the awareness that he was standing at a crossroads where every word would carry consequences. He could still back down, still mumble something apologetic, and drive away. But that would mean abandoning everything he believed about accountability, about the rule of law, about the principle that no one, not even those sworn to enforce the law, should be above it. For speeding, Marcus replied evenly. I recorded you doing approximately 78 miles per hour in a 65 zone. No emergency lights, no sirens, nothing to indicate you were responding to a call. You were just driving like that because you could. And I think your supervisors should know about it. The silence that followed was absolute. For perhaps 3 seconds, Deputy Kowalski simply stared at Marcus, processing what he had just heard. A civilian, a stranger, had not only observed his speeding, but had recorded it, and was now openly declaring his intention to report it. The audacity of the challenge seemed to momentarily stun the deputy into paralysis. Then his expression transformed. The neutral mask dissolved into something closer to contempt, a cold anger that radiated from every line of his face. When he spoke again, his voice carried the unmistakable edge of a man who had decided that this encounter was going to proceed on his terms, regardless of what the law or the Constitution might have to say about it. License, registration, and proof of insurance. Marcus felt his own resolve crystallize in response. No. Excuse me. No, deputy, you didn't pull me over. I haven't committed any traffic violation. You have no legal basis to demand my identification, and I'm not going to hand it over just because you're upset that I recorded you breaking the law. The words landed like physical blows. Deputy Kowalski's jaw tightened visibly, and his hand drifted toward the equipment on his belt in an unconscious gesture of preparation. The situation was escalating rapidly, moving toward a confrontation that neither man could fully control. Sir, you pulled over on my traffic stop. That gives me every right to— I didn't pull over on your traffic stop, Marcus interrupted calmly. I pulled over here, well ahead of your position, because my phone rang and I needed to answer it. Your traffic stop was back there. I'm up here. The two events are completely unrelated, and you know that as well as I do. What was unfolding on that roadside shoulder was a fundamental clash between two different understandings of authority. For Deputy Kowalski, his badge represented an absolute power that could not be questioned. When he demanded something from a citizen, compliance was not optional. It was simply expected, the natural order of things. The idea that someone might refuse, might assert their own rights against his authority, was not just unexpected. It was intolerable. For Marcus, the situation was governed by entirely different principles. He understood, because he had been trained to understand, that police authority has limits. An officer cannot simply demand identification from any citizen at any time for any reason. There must be a legal basis, a reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, a legitimate investigative purpose. Without those elements, the demand is nothing more than harassment, an abuse of the badge that citizens have every right to refuse. This is something that many people never learn until it is too late. The courts have established clear guidelines about when police can demand identification and when citizens are free to refuse. But law enforcement often relies on public ignorance of these rights, using intimidation and the implied threat of arrest to compel compliance that is not actually required. When you encounter a police officer who is asking for your ID, the first question you should always ask yourself is whether this is a consensual encounter or a lawful detention. If you are not being detained, if you are legally free to leave, then you are also free to decline to provide identification, and the officer has no authority to punish you for that refusal. Deputy Kowalski was about to discover just how well Marcus Thornton understood these principles. If you're going to continue down this road, Marcus said, his voice steady and controlled, then I'm going to need you to call your sergeant out here. I want a supervisor present before this goes any further. The request was entirely reasonable, the kind of measured response that any trained officer would recognize as appropriate. When a citizen believes their rights are being violated, requesting supervisory involvement is exactly the right thing to do. It de-escalates tension, introduces accountability, and ensures that any subsequent actions are witnessed by someone with the authority to intervene. But Deputy Kowalski had no interest in de-escalation. Whatever was driving his behavior, whether it was ego, anger, embarrassment, or simple ignorance of the law, had pushed him past the point where reasonable solutions were acceptable. He wanted compliance, he wanted submission, and he was willing to cross every legal and constitutional line to get it. You're going to give me your license and registration right now, or we're going to have a serious problem. Get your sergeant out here. License and registration. I'm not giving you anything until your supervisor arrives. Call your sergeant. Sir, you are now obstructing my investigation. Do you understand that? Obstruction is a criminal offense, and if you continue to refuse to cooperate, I will place you under arrest. Marcus shook his head slowly, a gesture that conveyed both disappointment and resignation. Obstruction requires a physical act of interference with an officer's duties. Standing here in my own vehicle, refusing to answer questions I'm not legally required to answer is not obstruction. It's my constitutional right. And you know that. You've had the same training I have. The mention of training caught Deputy Kowalski off guard. What do you mean the same training? I'm a reserve officer with the Aurora Police Department. I've been through the academy. I know exactly what my rights are, and I know exactly what yours are. You have no probable cause to arrest me, no reasonable suspicion to detain me, and no legal authority to demand my identification. If you disagree, call your sergeant. Let him sort this out. For a moment, something flickered in the deputy's expression, a brief flash of uncertainty that suggested he was beginning to realize he might have misjudged this situation. But the moment passed quickly, overwhelmed by the momentum of his own aggression. Step out of the vehicle. I want your sergeant here first. Step out of the vehicle now, or I will tase you. The threat of the taser changed everything. Until that moment, the encounter had been a battle of words, a legal chess match where both participants understood the rules. But the introduction of physical force transformed it into something far more dangerous. Marcus recognized immediately that he had reached the limit of what verbal resistance could accomplish. Continuing to refuse might result in serious injury, and no amount of legal righteousness was worth that risk. Slowly, deliberately, Marcus opened his door and stepped out onto the shoulder of the highway. He moved carefully, keeping his hands visible, doing everything in his power to avoid giving the deputy any excuse to escalate further. As he emerged from the vehicle, he spoke calmly but clearly, ensuring that every word would be captured by the body cameras that both men knew were recording. I want it noted that I am complying with your orders under protest. I do not consent to this detention. I have committed no crime and you have no legal basis for this arrest. I am cooperating only because you have threatened me with violence. Deputy Kowalski ignored the statement completely. He grabbed Marcus by the arm, spun him around, and began applying handcuffs with more force than necessary. The metal bit into Marcus's wrists as the deputy ratcheted them tight, each click a small punctuation mark on the violation of his rights. You have a weapon on you. Yes, I'm licensed to carry. My permit is in my wallet. Where's the weapon? Right hip. Holstered. Deputy Kowalski removed the firearm with practiced efficiency, securing it before continuing with the arrest. As he guided Marcus toward the patrol car, other deputies began arriving on scene, their vehicles pulling onto the shoulder with lights flashing. The radio chatter had apparently attracted attention, and now half a dozen officers were converging on what should have been a simple traffic complaint. I want to pause here and ask you something directly. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew your rights were being violated, but felt powerless to do anything about it? Have you ever watched someone in uniform cross lines that should never be crossed, knowing that speaking up might only make things worse? If this story is resonating with you, if it is bringing up memories or emotions from your own experiences, I want to hear about it in the comments. These conversations matter. They help others understand that they are not alone, and they help build the collective knowledge that empowers all of us to assert our rights when they are challenged. The rear of Deputy Kowalski's patrol car was exactly as Marcus had imagined it would be. The hard plastic seat offered no comfort, designed as it was for suspects rather than passengers. The cage separating the back from the front was close enough to touch, and the windows were tinted just enough to make the outside world seem distant and slightly unreal. Marcus sat with his hands cuffed behind his back, his shoulders already beginning to ache from the unnatural position. He watched through the window as more deputies gathered around Deputy Kowalski, listening to his explanation of the arrest. From this distance, Marcus could not hear what was being said, but he could read the body language. Kowalski was animated, gesturing broadly, clearly defending his actions with the confidence of someone who believed he was entirely in the right. The other deputies nodded along, though Marcus thought he detected some skepticism in their postures. Then a new vehicle arrived, and Marcus felt a small spark of hope ignite in his chest. The silver Chevrolet Tahoe that pulled onto the shoulder bore the markings of a supervisory vehicle, and the man who emerged from it had the bearing of someone accustomed to commanding respect. This, Marcus realized, must be the sergeant he had been requesting all along. Detective Sergeant Patricia Hendricks was a 15-year veteran of the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, a woman who had risen through the ranks by combining intelligence with integrity. She had seen plenty of bad arrests in her career, and she had learned to recognize the warning signs almost immediately. As she approached the cluster of deputies gathered around Kowalski, she was already cataloging the inconsistencies in what she was observing. The conversation that followed was captured in fragments on various body cameras, a mosaic of perspectives that would later be assembled into a coherent narrative for legal purposes. Sergeant Hendricks listened as Deputy Kowalski explained his version of events, her expression carefully neutral. When he finished, she asked a single question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. Did this man physically approach your traffic stop? Did he exit his vehicle and move toward you while you were conducting your business with the other motorist? No, ma'am. He stayed in his car the whole time. He was just filming. Filming from inside his vehicle parked 70 yards away? Yes, ma'am. And that's what you arrested him for? Filming? The silence that followed was more damning than any accusation could have been. Deputy Kowalski shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his earlier confidence visibly deflating. Around him, the other deputies exchanged glances that communicated volumes about their assessment of the situation. I arrested him for obstruction, Kowalski finally said. He refused to provide identification when I asked for it. Did he have a legal obligation to provide identification? He was at the scene of my traffic stop. I needed to determine who he was and what he was doing there. Raymond, Sergeant Hendricks' voice carried the quiet weight of disappointment. You know as well as I do that filming a traffic stop from a distance is not illegal. You know that refusing to provide identification in a consensual encounter is not obstruction. You know that we cannot arrest people simply because they make us uncomfortable or because they question our actions. So what exactly did this man do that constitutes a crime? Deputy Kowalski had no answer. His jaw worked silently for a moment, as if searching for words that might somehow justify what he had done. Finding none, he simply shook his head. It's weak, he finally admitted. I know it's weak. It's not weak, Raymond. It's non-existent. You arrested a citizen for exercising his constitutional rights, and you did it because your ego couldn't handle being called out for speeding. Do you have any idea what you've just done? Do you have any concept of the liability you've created for this department? The conversation continued, but Sergeant Hendricks had already made her decision. She walked away from the cluster of deputies and approached the patrol car where Marcus sat waiting. Opening the rear door, she crouched down to put herself at eye level with the handcuffed man inside. Sir, I'm Sergeant Hendricks. I'm the supervisor on duty this morning. Can you tell me your version of what happened here? Marcus told his story simply and directly, laying out the sequence of events from the moment he first observed Deputy Kowalski speeding on the highway to the moment he found himself locked in the back of a patrol car. He provided details, specifics, the kind of clear and organized account that came naturally to someone with law enforcement training. When he finished, Sergeant Hendricks nodded slowly. Sir, I'm going to be honest with you. Based on everything I've heard, I don't believe Deputy Kowalski had probable cause to arrest you. He had no legal basis to demand your identification, and your refusal to provide it does not constitute obstruction under any reasonable interpretation of the law. I'm going to have these handcuffs removed, and I'm going to apologize to you on behalf of the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. The words washed over Marcus like a wave of relief, though they could not undo what had already been done. His wrists ached where the cuffs had bit into them. His shoulders throbbed from the uncomfortable position, and somewhere deep in his chest, a cold anger had begun to settle, an awareness that this should never have happened in the first place. The handcuffs came off, and Marcus stepped out of the patrol car as a free man. He stood on the shoulder of the highway, rubbing circulation back into his wrists, watching as Sergeant Hendricks walked back toward Deputy Kowalski with an expression that promised consequences. Around them, the other deputies had begun to drift back to their own vehicles, clearly eager to distance themselves from a situation that had gone badly wrong. Then came the moment that would seal Deputy Kowalski's fate. Sergeant Hendricks ordered the deputy to approach Marcus and deliver an apology personally. It was the right thing to do, a gesture of accountability that might have begun the process of healing. But Deputy Kowalski clearly had no interest in reconciliation. He walked toward Marcus with the stiff movements of someone operating under extreme duress, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles stood out in cords along his neck. "Here's my card," Kowalski said, thrusting a business card toward Marcus without meeting his eyes. "I didn't intend for things to go this direction." "They did. So, I apologize. But that's all I have to say about it." The words were technically an apology, but everything about their delivery screamed contempt. The tone was flat and hostile, the posture was aggressive, and the subtext was crystal clear. Kowalski believed he had done nothing wrong, and this forced apology was an insult he would not soon forget. Marcus met the deputy's gaze steadily. "You should have known better." "I'll hold my tongue about that, sir." "Am I free to go?" "Yes, sir, you're free to go." "Then I'll see you in court." What happened next was captured perfectly by the body cameras of 3 different deputies. As Marcus turned to walk back toward his Honda, Deputy Kowalski muttered something under his breath, just loud enough to be picked up by the microphones. Then, in a gesture of crude defiance, he grabbed himself obscenely and raised his middle finger toward Marcus's retreating back. Sergeant Hendricks witnessed the entire thing. "What did he just say?" she demanded, turning toward one of the other deputies. The response was delivered with the uncomfortable honesty of someone who knew exactly how damaging the truth would be. He called the man an obscenity, said he'd see him in court, and then made a vulgar gesture. For a long moment, Sergeant Hendricks simply stood there, absorbing the full weight of what she had just witnessed. In less than 30 minutes, Deputy Raymond Kowalski had managed to commit an unlawful arrest, violate a citizen's constitutional rights, create massive liability for the county, and then compound all of that with an act of petty childish defiance that had been captured on multiple cameras. The fallout from this incident would take months to fully materialize, but its eventual shape was never really in doubt. Marcus Thornton retained a civil rights attorney, a specialist in police misconduct cases who had built a career holding law enforcement accountable for exactly this kind of abuse. Together, they documented every aspect of what had occurred, assembling body camera footage, witness statements, and legal precedents into an airtight case for First Amendment retaliation. In June of that year, a formal demand letter was sent to the Jefferson County Attorney's Office outlining the violations and announcing the intent to file a federal lawsuit. The letter detailed the constitutional protections that had been trampled, the clear lack of probable cause for the arrest, and the egregious conduct of Deputy Kowalski, both during and after the incident. It demanded accountability, transparency, and compensation for the harm that had been inflicted on Marcus Thornton's rights and dignity. The county's response came faster than expected. Rather than face the certainty of defeat in federal court, rather than endure the embarrassment of a public trial that would expose every detail of Kowalski's misconduct, the county agreed to settle. The amount was $95,000, paid from public funds to compensate Marcus for his wrongful arrest and the violation of his constitutional rights. Let me put that number in context for you. $95,000 is more than the median household income in Jefferson County. It is enough to buy a new car, to make a down payment on a house, to fund several years of college tuition. And it was paid, every single cent of it, by the taxpayers of that county. Not by Deputy Kowalski, not by the sheriff's office budget, by ordinary citizens who had no involvement whatsoever in the incident, but who now found themselves footing the bill for one officer's ego and incompetence. This is one of the great injustices of our current system. When police officers violate constitutional rights, when they make wrongful arrests or use excessive force, they almost never face personal financial consequences. The lawsuits are paid by insurance policies and taxpayer funds. The officers keep their jobs, keep their pensions, keep their authority. The only people who truly pay the price are the victims and the public, while the actual perpetrators continue on as if nothing happened. And in Deputy Kowalski's case, this pattern proved disturbingly consistent. Local news investigations revealed that this was not his first brush with misconduct. In 2017, he had been arrested for driving under the influence, eventually pleading guilty to a lesser charge of impaired driving. Despite this criminal conviction, despite the obvious questions it raised about his judgment and fitness for duty, he had kept his job as a deputy. He had continued to carry a badge and a gun, to interact with the public, to make life-altering decisions about when to use force and when to make arrests. When reporters asked the sheriff's office whether Deputy Kowalski had faced any discipline for the wrongful arrest of Marcus Thornton, they were met with silence. The department confirmed that an internal investigation had been conducted, but refused to disclose its findings or any resulting punishment. Transparency, it seemed, was not among the values that the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office prioritized. This raises a question that I want you to think about carefully. What does it say about our society that we allow this kind of behavior to continue? What does it mean for the rule of law when those sworn to enforce it are never held personally accountable for their violations? And what can ordinary citizens do to change a system that seems designed to protect the powerful at the expense of everyone else? The answer, I believe, lies in stories like this one. Every time a case of police misconduct is documented and shared, every time the public learns about another abuse of power, another settlement paid from their tax dollars, another officer who faced no real consequences for violating someone's rights, the pressure for reform grows a little stronger. Public awareness is the first step toward public action, and public action is the only force powerful enough to change institutions that have grown comfortable with their own impunity. So if this story has affected you, if it has made you think differently about your own rights or the conduct of those who are supposed to serve and protect you, I have a request. Share it. Talk about it with friends and family. Consider what it would mean if this happened to you or someone you love, and maybe, just maybe, add your voice to the growing chorus of citizens demanding that accountability be more than just a word. The aftermath of the settlement offers a final lesson in the importance of understanding your constitutional rights. Marcus Thornton emerged from his ordeal with his dignity intact and a substantial financial compensation for his trouble. But far more valuable than the money was the vindication of his principles. He had stood up to an abuse of power. He had refused to be intimidated into surrendering rights that were guaranteed to him by the Constitution. And in the end, even though it took lawyers and legal processes and months of uncertainty, justice had been served. Not everyone is as fortunate. Across this country, every single day, people find themselves in similar confrontations with law enforcement. Some of them know their rights and assert them. Many more do not. They comply with demands they are not legally required to obey. They answer questions they are not obligated to answer. They submit to searches they have every right to refuse. And in doing so, they often provide exactly the evidence needed to prosecute them for crimes they might otherwise have never been charged with. The law is clear on these matters, even if the officers enforcing it often pretend otherwise. In a consensual encounter where you have not been detained and are theoretically free to leave, you have no obligation to provide identification, answer questions, or assist law enforcement in any way. The key is understanding when you are in a consensual encounter versus a lawful detention. And the simplest way to establish that distinction is to ask a single question: am I free to go? If the answer is yes, then you can leave. You can refuse to provide ID. You can decline to answer questions, and the officer has no authority to stop you or punish you for doing so. If the answer is no, then you are being detained. At that point, the Fourth Amendment requires the officer to have reasonable, articulable suspicion of criminal activity. If they do not have such suspicion, the detention itself is unlawful, and any evidence gathered as a result may be inadmissible in court. These are the principles that Marcus Thornton understood and asserted on that Wednesday morning in Jefferson County. They are principles that every American should know, because the constitutional rights we fail to exercise are often the constitutional rights we effectively lose. As I bring this story to a close, I want to leave you with one final thought. The $95,000 settlement that Jefferson County paid to Marcus Thornton will likely have no lasting impact on the behavior of the sheriff's office. It was not large enough to force systemic changes. It was not accompanied by any admission of wrongdoing or any public commitment to reform. Deputy Kowalski probably still wears his badge today, still carries his gun, still makes decisions about when to use force and when to make arrests. The only thing that can change these patterns is sustained public pressure, the kind that comes when citizens refuse to accept business as usual. When you share stories like this one, when you demand transparency from your local law enforcement, when you vote for officials who prioritize accountability over protection of institutional power, you become part of the solution. So let me ask you directly, was $95,000 enough? Did the outcome of this case represent justice, or was it simply a price that the county was willing to pay to make the problem go away? What would it take, in your view, to actually hold officers like Deputy Kowalski personally responsible for their actions? I would genuinely like to know what you think. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story has convinced you that these issues matter, that understanding your constitutional rights is not just academic, but essential, then I hope you will consider subscribing. Because stories like this happen every day in every corner of this country. And the more of us who are paying attention, the harder it becomes for those in power to pretend that nothing is wrong. Our rights do not end where someone else's authority begins. The badge is not a license to ignore the Constitution, and as long as there are citizens willing to stand up and say so, there remains hope that the system might eventually change. Until then, stay informed, know your rights, and never forget that the most powerful check on government abuse is an educated and engaged public.